You've probably heard about the winters of the Middle Ages, but before we dive into this icy journey, let me tell you what you imagine is nowhere near the reality. Those enchanted stories of crackling fireplaces, warm wines, and peaceful nights are far from how life really was during the coldest months in medieval history. It almost seems like we're talking about two different worlds, doesn't it? What you see in films and fantasy books is completely different from what people actually lived through. In reality, the medieval winter wasn't a fairy tale. It was, in fact, a season of daily struggles for survival. Every year, when the cold started to descend, peasants, nobles, and even kings found themselves at the mercy of the relentless low temperatures. There were no modern heaters, no proper clothing, and the architecture of the houses, far from being a protection against winter, often made things worse. Have you ever imagined the fear of the winter arriving, knowing that your life literally depended on the scarce firewood or whatever you managed to store in autumn? There were no supermarkets with shelves full of food, no heated blankets, and castles were not the warm and cozy fortresses we imagine. On the contrary, these huge stone buildings, designed to withstand attacks, often felt more like cold prisons than shelters. Now, picture yourself in a medieval house, where the only thing separating you from the immense winter is a cold stone wall. The cold seemed to penetrate everything, no matter how thick the clothing or how high the fire in the fireplace. The medieval winter wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a sentence of survival, where the freezing months were so cruel that even the richest people of the time, who thought they were protected, endured unimaginable hardships. And this, my friends, is the real medieval winter. Not a cozy fairy tale, but a constant battle against the relentless forces of nature. Now that you understand that the medieval winter wasn't just a minor inconvenience, let's talk about the cold itself. And when I say cold, I'm talking about an unrelenting cold. Temperatures that weren't just uncomfortable but downright deadly. The medieval winter wasn't about having cold hands or frozen feet. It was a true fight for survival against the ice. Temperatures could drop drastically, often reaching -10°C or even lower, depending on the region. And if you think this was rare or an occasional occurrence, you're sorely mistaken. Winters, as we've seen, lasted for months, and the extreme cold was present in nearly all of medieval Europe. Imagine living in a time when your clothing wasn't suitable, your house poorly insulated, and the only protection against the cold was a rudimentary fireplace that barely warmed the room. When the cold reached these deadly levels, peasants, who spent most of their time outdoors, suffered immensely. There were no thermal clothes, no waterproof boots. The layers of wool and animal skins they wore were more to shield them from the elements, but were far from sufficient to combat the real threat. Cold-related diseases, such as hypothermia and frostbite, were common and often fatal. And what's worse, people couldn't protect themselves with heaters or constant warmth. If the fire went out or the wood ran out, survival became much harder. The fear of freezing to death was very real. Imagine sleeping in a straw bed, the fire extinguished and the biting cold entering through every crack in the house. Many people, in their struggle to survive, ended up dying in their sleep, victims of the unyielding cold that seemed to never relent. Now, let's take a look at the buildings of the time, which were impressive, but not in terms of warmth. Stone houses and thatched roofs are what come to mind when we think of a typical medieval home. On the outside, these homes seemed like fortresses against the elements, but the reality was very different. These structures were not designed to retain heat, and the people who lived in them were vulnerable to the winter cold in ways that are almost impossible to understand today. First, the stone walls, far from providing thermal insulation, acted as massive conductors of cold. The stones were freezing to the touch and, without the help of modern heating or insulating materials, they absorbed the moisture and cold from the outside. During the night, the temperatures inside the house were practically the same as those outside. If you lived in wealthier areas, you might have a fireplace, but remember, fuel was scarce and expensive. But if you were a peasant, the reality was even harsher. Often, the only thing separating you from the winter was a fragile stone wall that could barely block the cold winds. And don't be fooled, thatched houses, common among peasants, were even more vulnerable. While clay and wood might offer some protection, the thatched houses were the exact opposite of an efficient shelter against the cold. Heat escaped through every hole, and over time snow accumulated on the roofs, leaving the inhabitants on edge every day of winter. These houses barely heated and didn't always protect against the cold-related diseases. It was like living inside a giant freezer, with the constant threat that the winter could be the last. The worst part, there were no escapes. When the snow fell, you couldn't go out to gather more firewood or fresh food, as the roads were covered and dangerous. The medieval winter was a nightmare not only because of the struggle against the cold, but also because of the helplessness in relation to the buildings that, instead of protecting, only worsened the battle for survival. Now, let's dive into how people in the Middle Ages faced the winter with the very limited resources they had. When winter arrived, the first concern wasn't a warm meal or a cozy drink, it was simply surviving. Picture yourself in the middle of a harsh winter, with no heating, no fresh food, and the cold seeping into every part of your house. What would you do? Well, the answer was simple. fight to stay alive. With scarce resources, medieval families had to conserve every piece of wood, every scrap of cloth, and every grain of food. The fireplaces, if they existed, were the heart of the home, but the fire burned quickly, and the available wood was limited. If you were lucky enough to live in a house with a fireplace, the heat spread very little, and the smoke often invaded the room, causing more discomfort than relief. Food was another huge issue. There were no markets filled with options like today. Families relied on the autumn harvest to feed them through the winter, and those harvests were not always enough. Peasants, who already lived in precarious conditions, had to make do with the reserves they had, which often lasted only until halfway through the winter. And when the food ran out, what was left was to survive on whatever could be found: roots, tree bark, and in extreme cases, even rotten meat. Hunger was a constant, and the struggle for food was as desperate as the cold itself. Moreover, potable water was a rare luxury. Water sources froze, and peasants had to melt snow or gather water from ice-cold springs, making the simple act of staying hydrated a true ordeal. All they could do was conserve the little they had, hoping that spring would come soon and bring the promise of a new harvest. Imagine living every day with the constant risk of dying from hunger or cold, not knowing if your food supplies would last until the next harvest. This wasn't a distant possibility. It was a very real and brutal reality, making the medieval winter one of the most feared periods in history. During the medieval winter, the scarcity of food became one of the greatest threats to survival. The cold season was not only brutal because of the low temperatures, but because it interrupted the harvests and made it nearly impossible to find new food. When winter arrived, all that remained were the autumn reserves, and these were limited and often insufficient to last through the harshest months. The summer and autumn harvests were vital to ensure that people survived until spring. But when the cold arrived too early or lingered longer than expected, families found themselves racing against time to store enough food to get them through the winter. Often, the seeds that should have been planted in the fall for the next year's harvest were consumed before they could be planted, which further worsened the food scarcity. Additionally, pests, poor storage, and the lack of effective preservation techniques meant that much of the food reserves would spoil or be lost during the cold months. Corn, grains, and even dried meat, which were supposed to last through winter, were often damaged by moisture or worms, making them not only useless but a real health hazard. With roads blocked by snow and trade disrupted, towns and villages became isolated, and food scarcity created immense social pressure. The fear of hunger, a constant threat, became even more palpable for the poorest, especially peasants. The idea of surviving hunger turned into a life-or-death battle. The thin soups made from roots and grains became the only possible meals, with monotony that only increased the despair. Hunger was cruel and certain, especially for the most vulnerable, such as children, the elderly, and the sick. Without proper medical care and with weakened immune systems from lack of nutrients, many succumbed to malnutrition. The medieval winter wasn't just a cold season, it was a time of extreme scarcity, where survival depended more on luck and preparation than anything else. If you think medieval royalty was immune to the suffering of winter, think again. While kings and nobles had more resources than peasants, they were not free from the grasp of the relentless cold. Huge castles and imposing fireplaces, which seemed to be the solution to winter's harshness, were often insufficient to combat the extreme cold. The grand stone, which seemed solid and invincible on the outside, absorbed the cold and kept the castles at temperatures nearly as low as the outdoors. The large stone halls had no insulation, and the huge chimneys, no matter how impressive, often couldn't distribute heat effectively. The fire in the fireplaces didn't warm the vast dimensions of the castles, and often the smoke didn't vent properly through the chimneys, leaving the rooms with a heavy and suffocating air. The situation got even worse when scarce wood became the main fuel for the fires. Even the wealthiest in medieval society didn't have access to a constant supply of wood, meaning the flames from the fireplaces could die down quickly, leaving the castles cold inside. And this wasn't just a problem for the nobles, but also for their employees and servants, who were confined to the same spaces and suffered from the same cold. Moreover, while royalty had access to better quality clothing, it still wasn't enough to keep them warm during the harsh winters. Animal furs, heavy cloaks, and luxurious fabrics like velvet were worn, but none of these could prevent the biting colds from penetrating their bodies. Picture the nobles, dressed in their luxurious garments, feeling as exposed to winter as any peasant, and as much as they had wealth, they still had to face the same dangers. Cold-induced respiratory diseases, like pneumonia, were common among the nobility, and even kings and queens were subjected to these harsh conditions. The medieval winter didn't make distinctions based on social class. While nobles had more resources, they too were at the mercy of the same rigors of the season as the peasants. Royalty also had to fight against death by cold, only with a layer of opulence that, no matter how grand, couldn't protect against the immense power of nature. Now, let's talk about one of the most terrifying aspects of medieval winter: death by cold. In medieval winter, the risk of death wasn't just a distant possibility, it was a cruel and constant reality. It didn't matter what social class, status, or power someone had. When winter came in all its force, the fight for survival became a matter of life or death. Imagine a peasant heading to the village to gather supplies. The biting cold had already taken over the streets, and a snowstorm could fall at any moment. For these people, a simple walk to the next village could be fatal. With roads covered in snow and inadequate clothing, the human body, without proper heating, didn't have the necessary resilience to withstand the low temperatures for long periods. Many died from hypothermia, with their bodies literally freezing from the inside out. Other deaths occurred due to the loss of extremities, like fingers and toes, which were the first parts of the body to freeze. The sores caused by frostbite became gangrenous, leading to amputations or even death. And don't think death by cold was an isolated tragedy. It was everywhere. In many cases, winter was responsible for a huge mortality rate. In the villages, deaths from freezing were a constant threat. Without the warmth of fireplaces or proper shelter, peasants were at the mercy of the cold that penetrated to their bones. Disease, combined with food scarcity and lack of proper medical care, made winter a period of terror. The simple act of sleeping at night in a freezing environment could be fatal. During the coldest months, peasants were literally fighting against the cold to their last breath. Nobles, on the other hand, weren't immune to this risk. Even in their imposing castles, where fire was essential for warmth, the risk of death by cold still existed. As we've already mentioned, large fireplaces weren't enough to heat all the rooms in the castle. When the fire went out or the wood ran out, the nobles were just as vulnerable as the peasants. Epidemics caused by the cold, like pneumonia and severe flu, were common among the royalty too. But while peasants died slowly, with the cold consuming them from the inside out, nobles, with their limited resources, were also forced to face the reality that winter could be fatal for everyone. Death by freezing was a tangible threat during the medieval winter. Each day of winter meant one more day of the fight for survival, and death, which started as a feeling of intense cold, ended with the body being overtaken by the merciless forces of nature, with no mercy, no warning, as if the very season was sentencing those who dared challenge its power. Now, let's talk about the complete sense of isolation that made medieval winter not only a physical torture, but a psychological one too. During the Middle Ages, winters not only isolated people physically but emotionally as well. Villages were distant from one another, and roads were often covered with snow, making travel nearly impossible. Imagine being stuck in your house, unable to go out to get food, wood, or even just to distract yourself with the company of others. This isolation not only increased physical suffering, but also created a desperate atmosphere of loneliness. If you lived in rural areas, the challenges were even greater. Houses were located in remote regions, where communication with other villages or even the nearest town was practically non-existent during the winter. Snow blocked the roads, and storms made any attempt to travel a suicidal mission. Moreover, because the villages were small, people were stuck in their own little worlds with little to no social interaction. The fear of hunger, cold, and disease became more intense because isolation prevented any help from arriving in time. In the larger cities, the situation wasn't much better. Although there were more resources and more people, medieval cities were densely populated, and the living conditions were difficult. The narrow, winding streets, often clogged with snow, became a nightmare for those trying to leave. The lack of quick communication between villages and cities meant that diseases and disasters could spread quickly, and medical help, if it was available, arrived too late. This isolation wasn't limited to the logistical difficulties of communication and travel. It also affected people's mental health. During the winter months, peasants and city dwellers had little to no access to entertainment, culture, or socialization. The long, dark nights without light, freezing temperatures, and the constant fear of death made medieval winter a time of profound psychological despair. Without the technologies and comforts we have today, life seemed like an endless cycle of suffering, where the only things that changed were the amount of snow falling or the intensity of the wind. The feeling of helplessness and hopelessness was a heavy burden during the medieval winter. Being trapped in a cycle of isolation, facing the rigors of cold and scarcity, without knowing when relief would come, was a reality for thousands of people. And for those who didn't live in castles or more prosperous lands, winter was an insurmountable enemy that separated families and condemned many to obscurity. Now, let's take a close look at life in the villages during the medieval winter. For peasants, the freezing season wasn't just a time of discomfort, it was a constant struggle for survival. The conditions in the villages were vastly different from what nobles experienced in castles, and most people lived in simple houses made of wood, clay, and straw. These structures, while offering some protection, were terrible at insulating against the cold. The thin, poorly constructed walls allowed the cold air to invade the homes, making the interior almost as cold as the outside. The fireplaces, when present, were the only source of heat. But these fires didn't properly warm the small, poorly insulated homes. Families had to gather around the fire, trying to share body heat, while the biting cold took over the rest of the house. Fuel to keep the fire going was scarce and expensive, making it even harder to survive the winter without suffering. Food was another huge problem. without the resources of large cities or the stores that castles could afford to maintain. Peasants relied on their autumn harvest to feed them through the winter, but as we've seen, the harvests weren't always enough, and the food ran out quickly. This meant that, during the harshest months, families were left without food, relying only on roots, dried vegetables, and anything else they could find. The risk of starvation was real, and the feeling of desperation grew as the reserves dwindled. Not to mention, because the villages were so isolated, fresh food trade between the cities was practically impossible during the winter. The roads were covered with snow, and the merchant caravans that normally supplied the villages couldn't reach them, making the scarcity even worse. Winter in the villages was marked by the constant battle against nature, where the fear of death from hunger or cold was ever present. Furthermore, peasants had no access to proper medical care. Any illness that arose could be fatal, as there were no effective medicines or doctors to help. The houses were poorly ventilated, and the moisture that entered the homes made the environment perfect for the spread of respiratory diseases. Pneumonia and other infections were common, and the death of a loved one due to something as simple as a cold was a daily tragedy for these families. In reality, the medieval winter in the villages wasn't just a season of the year, but a time of pure terror, where each day brought new challenges and more hardships. For peasants, winter wasn't just a season, it was a true sentence of suffering and resistance. Despite all the hardships, the medieval winter also revealed something extraordinary about humans: the incredible ability to endure seemingly insurmountable adversities, even in the face of relentless cold, scarcity of resources, and the constant threat of death. People in the Middle Ages found ways to fight for survival, even when the odds were slim. Human strength during the medieval winter was something that defied logic. People, even without modern comforts like central heating and proper clothing, did what they could to protect themselves. Layers of clothing made from animal furs and thick fabrics were unlikely, but they were some of the few defenses peasants had against the cold. When the wood for the fire ran out, families were forced to seek alternatives, such as heating stones or using makeshift clay stoves, which, although small, helped to distribute some warmth. Moreover, the villages were true examples of communal cooperation. People came together to share the little they had: food, wood, and human warmth. While winter was a time of solitude and fear, there was also a sense of community among the villagers. This spirit of unity was often the key to surviving the coldest months. Every community member did what they could to help one another, even if it meant putting their own survival at risk. Medieval winter might have been brutal, but human resilience in the face of it showed how collaboration and the will to survive could overcome even the greatest obstacles. The villages, with their simple, small houses, were battlegrounds against the elements. Each house represented a line of defense, each fireplace an attempt to withstand the deadly cold. Families faced winter not only as a season but as a war against nature, where the survival strategy often depended on a series of improvisations and innovations that defied the limits of available resources. In some regions, the church played a key role in helping mitigate the horrors of winter. Christmas, which today we associate with festive celebrations and abundance, was in the Middle Ages a rare opportunity for families to come together and share a simple meal. The church also provided spiritual support, which helped people endure the feelings of despair that often took over during the winter months. But human resistance wasn't just in physical survival, it was also in the mental capacity to withstand the endless days of cold and scarcity. The medieval winter, as immense a challenge as it was, also served as a test of character and resilience. In the end, what truly stood out was the incredible willpower of people to endure, to live one more day, and to wait for the winter to finally give way to spring. If you enjoyed this journey through the medieval winter and want to learn more about the fascinating stories from the past, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It helps a lot with the channel's growth and motivates us to bring more content like this to you. Drop a comment below telling us what you thought of the video, and share it with your friends so everyone can join us on this time travel adventure. See you next time.